Alright, this wasn't a video I was even expecting I'd have the time to make, but my plans for today went faster than I thought, and some folks on social media suggested I get around to doing this, so here we are. This is basically just going to be a rundown of my tweet thread on the subject, but since I know not everyone does social media or follows me on there, I decided to put this out just to get the info out there. So yesterday I was doing some research for a completely separate personal project of mine, and I specifically was trying to remember something about a Marvel vs. Capcom soundtrack release. I knew there was a Marvel game with a physical OST release that got bonus arranged tracks on it back in the 90s, but I couldn't remember if it was Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter or Marvel vs. Capcom 1 that had it. As it turns out, the answer was both. Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter's OST has a jazz arrangement of Zangief's theme in that game, but Marvel 1's, curiously, has new CPS2 arrangements of a few themes separate from the ones in the final game. Even more curiously, these bonus songs for the latter OST aren't on the disc. You had to use a URL tucked in the OST insert that takes you to a secret site for Capcom's sound label at the time, Seal Pewter. There's user credentials they give you to log into a second site, and boom. Here, you can listen to slightly arranged versions of Wolverine and Chun-Li's Marvel 1 themes. They're in AIF format and fuzzy as all hell because it was 1998, but it's a really fascinating find. Here's some quick samples. Even more fascinating though is a section titled Producer's Essay. This is a developer diary of sorts by the game's producer, Kenji Kataoka. You may not have heard of him, but he's been credited as a producer in a lot of Capcom games from the 90s and 2000s, and is still at the company, most recently having credits in Dragon's Dogma 2 and Kunitsugami. Here, he lays out some of the Marvel characters he and other Capcom staff proposed for Marvel 1 and why they did or didn't get in. This isn't the first time we've heard about this. Katsuya Akitomo is a former Capcom staff member who I've referenced quite a few times in my videos, thanks to his pretty candid tweet thread about the very same subject from his perspective a few years back. In fact, some of Kataoka's musings here line up exactly with what we've been told by Akitomo. Just think, this has been sitting on some obscure website archived by the Wayback Machine all this time, just waiting to be discovered. Alright, enough teasing. Like I said on Twitter, I used Google Translate for this because while I can read some Japanese, I don't trust my understanding, or lack thereof, enough to depend entirely on that to deliver this information. So first off, in Marvel 1's earliest development phase, the game's internal codename was seemingly Marvel Superheroes 2. Capcom had a list of Marvel characters drafted up that they wanted to propose to Marvel for the game. These characters were Captain America, Hulk, Wolverine, Gambit, Psylocke, Thor, Doctor Doom, Juggernaut, Magneto, and Thanos. Nothing we couldn't have guessed on our own outside of Thor. More on him in a bit. Marvel had already preemptively sent Capcom a short list of additional characters that were all clear to use. As far as heroes go, they were Beast, Deathlock, Iron Fist, Quasar, Namor, Sasquatch, Machine Man, Elektra, Speedball, Spider-Woman, and Medusa. And for villains, there was Fin Fang Foom, Super Skrull, the Wizard, Ultron, Diablo, Scorpion, and Doc Ock. Interesting stuff so far. Fin Fang Foom seems like kind of a wild thing to suggest, but we'll circle back to him in a bit as well. After some deliberation, Kataoka pared down his list of proposed Marvel characters to 11, most of which are in the final game in some fashion. Cap, Spidey, Wolverine, Hulk, Iron Man, Thor, Psylocke, Venom, Jubilee, Mr. Fantastic, and Howard the Duck. Howard in particular stands out. Akitomo also mentioned Howard as a character that was proposed but shot down by Marvel definitively. We'll get into detail there in a sec. So when this list was sent to Marvel, some characters were approved and some were rejected for various reasons. Kataoka and some other senior members flew to the US to discuss this in person with Marvel. First was Iron Man. We already knew since Akitomo confirmed this was the case as well, but Kataoka confirms again that Iron Man couldn't be used because another company had exclusive rights to the character. The other company isn't named, likely for legal reasons, but is pretty much 99.9% likely to be acclaimed for the Iron Man and X-O-Man War Heavy Metal crossover game. He adds something that we hadn't known beforehand though, and it's something I really wish I'd have known before releasing that War Machine video. Using War Machine and recoloring Iron Man's old sprite to get around that license issue? That was actually Marvel's idea, not Capcom's, which is just fantastic. On that note, Kataoka goes on to confirm something I've tried to make sure I've only argued as speculation, since there didn't seem to be any official word on it, and all we could do was make educated guesses based on circumstantial evidence. But he outright states that the Fantastic Four were also tied up in the same kind of exclusivity contract. Again, the company is unnamed, and again, I'm 99% sure it's Acclaim, who had a Fantastic Four brawler on PS1 that same year. This one's interesting because we don't know if Doom falls under that too, since he doesn't specify here. Though considering Dr. Doom is the final boss of that game, I'd have to imagine so. Interesting that Super Skrull was legally okayed at this point though, despite being a Fantastic Four character. He'd have to wait another 13 or so years for his turn. Kataoka apparently tried to fight for even just a Fantastic Four background cameo, but Marvel said the contract was pretty airtight, so Capcom had no other choice but to listen. I do want to point out that the Daily Bugle stage in Marvel 1 has 4 Freedoms Plaza tucked into the upper right corner of the stage, and is only visible if you super jump. I wonder if they either negotiated this with Marvel, or just snuck this in without them knowing. Thor was surprisingly also a character tied up in licensing, and I have no idea what game or company that could have been for. But even more interesting is Kataoka noting that Thor's licensing issue only applied to the US. He was actually legally okayed for use in Japan. He goes on to say that late in development, Marvel gave them the word that Thor's license issues had been cleared in the US, so they had the green light. Unfortunately, they didn't have any space on the roster left for him, so they just stuck him in as an assist instead. Kataoka goes on to talk about their initial proposed final boss for the game, Galactus. Akitomo spoke at length about this in his tweet thread from a few years back, mentioning how Marvel vetoed it because Galactus was simply too strong in their opinion, and Akitomo fought back against that, using examples of times where he'd been beaten. Kataoka corroborates this back and forth between Akitomo and Marvel as well. After rejecting Galactus, Marvel suggested 2 other final boss characters instead, and none of them were actually Onslaught. The first counter-offer was a character we've never even heard was considered for the series until now, Loki. Capcom actually considered this for a bit. Being a magician and the reason the Avengers existed in the first place, he'd fit thematically, and Capcom had a bunch of room for creativity with his moveset. But Kataoka notes that there was concern about Japan not finding a dude in green and yellow tights cool enough. The second character was Fin Fang Foom, with Marvel's reasoning being that him being a dragon meant that he would fit as a giant boss, and that an Iron Man villain as a boss would be cool. Kataoka says what we're probably all thinking having heard that, noting how dumb it is that an Iron Man villain was okay, but Iron Man himself was off limits. Kataoka, apparently frustrated with all of the rejections, just started mouthing off Marvel villains at random just to get the Marvel representative to say yes to at least one. One of which was actually Carnage, which Marvel rejected. One of these characters was Onslaught, which actually apparently made the Marvel rep pause for a bit before saying they'll get back to them on that. Seeing an opportunity, Akitomo apparently later made a formal request for Onslaught, and after waiting a few weeks, Marvel okayed his inclusion, sending along some reference material for him as well. I always figured Onslaught was a Marvel suggestion, and War Machine was a Capcom one all these years, so it's cool to see it was actually the other way around. Kataoka then doubles back to Howard the Duck, noting that some staff really wanted him in the game. The person in charge of designing him was apparently halfway done when Marvel said no, but they were so passionate and invested in him that they started circulating a petition around Capcom to get Marvel to change their mind. Of course, the answer was still no. Speaking of rejections, he reveals that Venom was a character that was proposed as far back as Marvel superheroes, but was rejected back then. They decided to try again for Marvel 1 and were surprised when Marvel said okay without any issue. Kataoka speculates that Marvel probably trusted Capcom's talent at that point, having done 4 Marvel fighters already. Psylocke was a character that was cleared and was going to be playable again, but Capcom ran into the same issue as Vampire Savior and ran out of space for more characters in the ROM data. They then decided to include her as an assist instead. Jubilee was a character that Kataoka in particular was really pushing for in the playable roster, somewhat selfishly he admits. When Psylocke had to be cut though, the devs realized they actually only had room for 1 new Marvel character on the roster, and it came down to either Jubilee or Venom. Atsushi Tomita, the game's lead planner, apparently made the call to use Venom, assuring Kataoka that there will be other games in the future to implement her in, which apparently didn't comfort Kataoka too much. They did decide to use her as an assist though. That's mostly everything in the producer's essay section. There's also a bit that mentions Ghost Rider and Silver Surfer were apparently off limits legally as well. The rest of the website just has thank you messages from the staff, though there is one Easter egg revealed there that I don't think has been documented anywhere else. One of the game's programmers, Manabu Kawase, alludes to something secret happening if you enter KAW as your initials on the high score screen. Doing so automatically changes the entered initials to TLD instead. This is in reference to the developer pseudonym he's sometimes credited under at Capcom, KAW-TLD. And that's everything on the site. Outside of Akitomo's tweets and a few recent ones from Tomita in the wake of the Marvel collection, I don't think we've ever had a look this candid into the roster selection process of Marvel 1, and it's still blowing my mind I ran into this by chance. I'll link the website as archived in the Wayback Machine in the description if you want to see all of this for yourself. That's going to do it for this video though. As always, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.